So I'll be speaking about violent extremist youth subcultures online, and just as a kind of warning, there will be some terrorist content as part of the presentation. It's nothing too explicit in the sense of sort of depictions of violence, but just kind of wanted to let people know in advance. So I'll start off with a bit of a timeline of mass casualty attacks that I think are tied to some of these violent extremist subcultures that I'll be speaking about. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it includes some of the most important cases from across the last 10 years. There's some cases that you may expect that aren't in there because the perpetrators actually weren't all that young, and some other people that I don't think were quite necessarily immersed in extremist subcultures online. But really starting with Elliot Rodgers' attack, inspired by incel ideology in 2014, all over the Charleston attack, the 2016 Munich attack in a shopping mall, which at the time initially really wasn't classified as a hate crime or as violent extremism. I think the sort of consensus on this has much shifted. Another incel attack in Canada in 2018, and then perhaps most seminally the year 2019 with the Christchurch attack, the kind of modes of dissemination of propaganda around this, and the many, many copycat attacks that we've seen both in 2019 but also last year with Buffalo and Bratislava. The average of these attackers listed here was sort of 21.7 years old, so they were all kind of relatively young. Both the Munich attacker and the Buffalo attacker were 18. The Christchurch attacker was 28, so that's kind of the spectrum that you're having there in between. But the fact that some of these individuals acted so young and barely having reached adulthood also tells you that some of them were radicalized when they were even younger. People may be familiar or not familiar with the case of the 13-year-old in Estonia who was sort of one of the leading characters in a group called Fire Creek Division, which ultimately was banned by the UK government, paradoxically after it had already declared itself to be dissolved. You see quite a lot in the context of the UK, especially that the arrests for people under 18 have risen quite dramatically. They now currently account for 20% of the overall terrorism-related arrests. And this is often tied to involvement in some of these violent extremist youth subcultures online in which some of this material is being circulated. So there's not really one study that I'm speaking about. It's sort of, 5 or 7 or 12. I'm not totally sure myself, so that it wouldn't really make sense for me to tell you about the methodology of one of our studies through which we've looked at this, but I thought what I'd maybe do as a replacement, because I hope it sort of gives people a picture of how we work, is sort of very, very quickly talk about sort of how ISD does its digital research, especially, and it very much applies to the way we analyze violent online extremist subcultures. There's the big data analysis through platform APIs where the data is available, getting as much data from mainstream platforms to also some of the more niche platforms where there isn't API access, and then kind of use techniques like natural language processing, machine learning. We have some very, very good tech partners, the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, that have been very helpful to kind of complement ISD's expertise, which is definitely more on the subject matter side than on the technical side. But we also just do a lot what people are now often calling digital ethnographic research. We spend a lot of time on 4chan, in Discord, in Telegram, in other forums where these subcultures have gathered and developed to understand what on earth they're talking about. What is their aesthetic? What are the themes? What are the memes? What are the jokes? What are some of the codes? Because the kind of big data stuff is interesting, and it kind of gives you a sense of the scale and some of the developments over time. But it really doesn't kind of replace or substitute for understanding these communities at a quite intimate level. Lastly, we often do, and this is kind of almost its own unit of people who specialize in OSINT and open source intelligence, to look into into attributing specific operations, hate speech campaigns and so, but also financing and web infrastructures tied to violent extremist groups. well, I'll skip past this one because it's a bit similar to the one before. There's a couple parallel threats really coming from online extremist subcultures. It's a parallel threat, in my view, both from formal groups like Atomwaffen Division, like previously National Action in the UK, but a trend that I think really, and I'll mostly be speaking now about a sort of series of trends associated with this 10-year era of violent extremism tied to online extremist subcultures, is that quite a lot of these attackers had no formal connection to extremist groups in the offline world. They weren't sort of connected to the local neo-Nazi chapter. It is more what people refer to as leaderless resistance, hence the image here of Louis Beam, an American neo-Nazi who sort of theorized some of this stuff in the 1980s. Even more influential, actually, I would say, is James Mason, another kind of old-school neo-Nazi writer. He's actually depicted in the middle of the Atomwaffen crowd as the one person without a mask, who really kind of fought through about having autonomous cells or even lone actor terrorists who can strike, who can avoid detection by law enforcement and security agencies, and therefore become much harder to detect than formal groups that kind of can be tracked, where there could be traitors, informants, and things like that. There's a few platforms that I want to talk about, and I can't go through all of them, but a few of the really seminal ones, I think, for the development of this is Iron March was a really pretty hard-edged neo-Nazi forum that existed between 2011 and 2017, and it's quite influential from my view for a number of reasons. Because there's some of these groups like Atomwaffen, like National Action, who organized through these. But also it sort of revived or kind of mainstreamed within these online subcultures some ideological trends that we keep on seeing it again and again being referenced in the manifestos of some of these attackers, which is the kind of neo-Nazi Satanist ideology of the Order of Nine Angles, but then also accelerationism, the kind of idea that through violent extremist attacks, terrorist attacks, attacks on public infrastructure, you bring about societal chaos, ideally collapse, civil war, which then will provide the breeding ground or the opportunity for these groups to win the civil war, to win the racial war, and create a fascist state, an ethno-state, whatever their specific aim is. There are the Chan boards, which again, the presentation was called Chantogram because it almost rhymes, but they have been 4chan in particular has been very influential in online culture, much larger than extremist online culture. I mean, it was originally established to share anime images. It has a very, very curious humor. I mean, if you've never been on 4chan, you would probably initially be a bit perplexed about some of the joke. It's often very provocative. It's almost always in very bad taste. Often references conspiracy theories. And it, over time, and especially from 2010 perhaps onwards, developed a very strong misogynist culture, often an anti-Semitic culture, anti-Muslim content that was being shared. And it has been very seminal in establishing memes, in establishing this transgressive humor. And it has, in quite a few cases, been tied to terrorist attacks. I mean, on the top here, you see the post through which the Christchurch attacker linked to his manifesto and live stream just before he conducted his attack. But there's other manifestos, like the Halle attacker, quite clearly referencing 4chan. And so there's some of these jokes, again, it sometimes seems a bit strange to have a presentation about terrorism and explain jokes, but on the bottom right here, you see a kind of meme which I think exemplifies this sort of provocative humor quite well. As you see an image of people with different skin colors, holding their hands over each other. It has slight Kumbaya or John Lennon's Imagine, it seems very peaceful, people holding each other's hand, but it is in this case really about Nazis, Muslims, leftists, libertarians, and anyone else who's not a neocon who are united in their hatred for Israel. And so it's a very sort of like typical style of expressing humor, hate through humor. Another very, very important well, it's both a platform and a network and a collective, I suppose. But there's a phenomenon, let's start there, called Telegram, organized on the platform, the messaging platform Telegram, which really became a hub, especially after the kind of demise of Iron March, for white supremacist and kind of pro-terrorist communities to share the manifestos of attackers, to share the propaganda material, to share sometimes pretty obscure ideological stuff from Julius Evola to, Nazi material, to some of the 09A stuff that I mentioned earlier, but also to share instructional material, to like, this is how you build a 3D weapon, this is how you build this would be good equipment if you're trying to commit this sort of attack. And so it really kind of became a hub of hundreds of channels to promote these kind of, not just ideas, but again, instructions. It's sometimes a bit confusing because it's both a network on a platform, but then it's also kind of a group or sort of a collection of individuals who publish actual, relatively lengthy PDFs in which they kind of compile ideological writings. And so it's the Telegram Collective, which on the right, on the right side you see one of its publications. And again, this is often quite instructional. This is really not just sort of why fascism is good, but also about like how to attack public infrastructure and sort of transport grids and things like that. And the cycle that we're seeing here, and that's another trend that I think is quite important also to distinguish some of these attacks from the more old school neo-Nazis, is that you usually have the violent attack first. You then have a live stream and or manifesto that are being spread online. It's being amplified, celebrated, discussed, repurposed, essentially amplified online with the intention of inspiring but also instructing future attacks. And the manifesto point is really interesting because for a very long time that really wasn't that common for extreme right perpetrators to do. Often they didn't even tell the public at all that they had committed a certain attack. Sort of the defense of the race against its enemies was almost worth it for its own sake. It's nothing that you necessarily need to communicate. But sort of from really the 2011 Oslo attack, it's something that we have seen much, much more frequently. The saints, there's a glorification of these extremist mass killers. This on the right side is a list of people who are venerated as saints, glorified as heroes of the movement for the white race. So it's really their idols. And it's an interesting list for a bunch of reasons. A, because it sort of compiles various attackers from across the decade, but also because some of these, a lot of these people are racist mass murderers of some sort, but some of them are kind of also just people engaged in mass shootings that weren't obviously political. There's the Unabomber on there, who's quite the icon among these communities. And so there's, beyond the political goals and beyond the ideological stuff, there's quite a lot of celebration of and veneration for violence. And it to some extent ties in very interestingly with some of these discussions around masculinity and gender that we're having in, I believe, 2 panels ago.
Are they exclusively men?
The perpetrators, the saints are all men. I'll kind of jump through the humor a little bit because I've actually talked about that quite a lot, but we'll maybe close with just, sometimes it's good to make a point like 3 or 4 times just so it sticks. It's not just the ideology, it's not just the connection, it's not just the networking, it is also despite the fact that many of the attackers that I've listed acted by themselves legally, legally they'd be lone actors, there's in many cases no accomplices sort of that would be sentenced for collaborating in the operational side of the attack. But it's very much a collective process in a few things. They're acting on behalf of a community, they're connecting with a community, they're thinking before the attack what jokes their community might find funny, but they are also compiling material to teach their followers, to teach other members of the community how to do this better. The Halle attacker, I believe, was the first to do self-constructed weapons. They worked terribly. He nevertheless killed 2 people, even though his sort of self-constructed guns kept jamming. But sort of one of the things he said in his manifesto was he wants to show people that it's possible to do it. You saw this in the Buffalo attack very much in the material. The manifesto was sort of, I think, 70% copy and paste, but it did contain quite a lot of stuff on equipment, on sort of ways to attack. And so people are teaching themselves by transmitting these videos, transmitting recommendations on material, how to do this well. And so it's almost this process of increasingly, as a community, getting better at committing more and more deadly attacks. And then lastly, implications for policy and practice. I'll actually focus on the second thing, interventions, because we spoke about this yesterday during the breakout session, and I think it's the maybe also just the weakest bit in terms of the response. And I don't think we'll be able to purely regulate ourselves out of this in terms of social media and content removal, as important as that is. I think it is really important to develop the new generation, and I mean, this was, apart from being a very inspiring speech, I think it also gave a lot of food for thought on how to approach young people and how to really take their grievances into account. What kind of online and offline interventions are needed to address these looser movements that are often not around sort of formal groups that necessarily know each other in persons, and how can you bring people out of these violent extremist ecosystems and online subcultures? How can you leverage some of the importance of these aesthetics, of the humor? How can you kind of like mess with the vibe and make it possible to limit their lethality, but also their reach in terms of spreading some of these ideas and instructional materials? And with that, I think there's a question slide, which is a good time for me to hand over back to you.